Hello everyone, today is Sunday, March the 9th. In a couple days, actually I believe it's March 14th, we have a full moon lunar eclipse in Virgo, and this is going to be the first eclipse in Virgo and Pisces that we're going to get starting this new eclipse cycle. I have to admit that I have a little bit of reluctance going into this one because I'm a guy with a lot of mutable placements. I did a little divination before recording this video though, and I don't think that I have too much to worry about heading into this one. And I have a bunch of ideas, ranging, as the people who follow my channel may realize, I tend to like to go in this direction that's kind of philosophical, but I also like to talk about what's happening in the world and what's happening at a more mundane level. So I'd say before getting into the philosophical stuff, I'm just going to address a few things at the mundane level, and at that level of you don't have to be into astrology to take a look at what's going on in the world and notice that we are in a particular moment of chaos and uncertainty, and things are not looking particularly good right now. And so there's a certain sort of sensitivity around what it's going to mean to have eclipse season in the midst of all this. Is already a mess, and now we're going to have eclipse season, and there's usually some, I don't know, eclipses are generally not associated with positive things happening. There could be some dramatic thing that continues to destabilize and throw everything into chaos and everything. And there's certain sense of this sort of like chaotic world we're living in, and what the archetype of Virgo means, and what a full moon lunar eclipse in Virgo means. That Virgo as the field maiden who is preparing, at the end of the summer, the harvest season, who is preparing for the winter. It's very kind of like, Game of Thrones, winter is coming, looking ahead, trying to prepare for what is on the horizon. And there's something about the current state of where we're at, where it's becoming more and more difficult to make plans for the future. And there's a kind of a mentality of, maybe I'll get into this a bit more later, because I was thinking about the whole dualism between spiritualism and materialism, or the idea of being able to plan ahead for the future versus just staying present with what is in the present moment, right? And but there can be some kind of, if you stay present with the present moment, then you can say that you're in a state of peace and relative ease, and there's no immediate danger, and it's a kind of a mental thing that we're all just praying to prepare for what could possibly happen, that has us all worked up and lost in all these projections of what could be, rather than dealing with reality, right? But then on the other hand, there is this sort of thing where, when it comes to what, like the trade war, for example, we recently had another postponement, and it's been an interesting, I don't want to spend my whole astrology channel just focusing on this, but I have been keeping it in mind quite a bit as a Canadian who's affected by it. I'm considering, so far, the last few months, I've been looking at the astrology, and each time it looks like they're going to start a trade war, it just looks like the astrology is it does not really seem like astrology that is conducive for the trade war. And it's just sort of interesting to see this play out month by month, and where it's postponed again. And it's also, there's this kind of like irony, or that if you postpone the trade war another month and it falls, you're going to start at April Fool's Day, And there's this whole, it's a kind of, it plays into this obvious, like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of thing. And it's like, but what if you just keep this thing up where you keep saying there's going to be a trade war and then you just keep delaying it, and it sort of like it creates this sort of situation of like tomorrow never comes, right? Like we're always just here in the present moment dealing with the reality, and you've got some crazy. But the thing is, it's kind of funny because when it comes to trade and finances, there's so much of it is in speculation or trying to like predict where the market's going to go or like how to adapt to the conditions to make things more affordable. And it's like the idea, like always expecting something that never actually arrives, has everybody's capacity to predict, capacity to plan, capacity to make, you know, a coherent strategy all kind of just messed up, right? And in the face, I think that basic quality that's in the air right now, if you think of Virgo as the planner, or the one that looks forward to the future and tries to prepare for what's coming, or the mercurial one who makes deals and negotiations, it's you can see that it's clear there's obviously some kind of moment where like it's like the power's out on that, like we can't that, or like you have, it's like as if you're trying to, your computer program, you have one program that's all about like having a coherent plan for the future, and you try to load up the program and it just crashes on you and you're like, we can't do anything, we don't know what's gonna like. As an astrologer, it's really interesting because it's a moment when the rational understanding of how the world works, you can see it sort of falling apart. And from a more intuitive sense, we can look at this and we can make more intuitive predictions about what may happen or what may not happen. And at this point in time, I'm almost thinking about making the positive statement or a real concrete prediction that the trade war isn't going to happen. Or that, I mean, whatever is happening now is us, the Canadians, for like applying tariffs onto, like, we're just starting the trade war ourselves because we're sick of this looming threat of something that's not going to happen. So now we are initiating it preemptively to say to take off the threat of tariffs, and then we'll take off the tariffs that we are actually applying, kind of thing. It's kind of a funny situation to be in. And so that's at the political level, anyways. There's other things going on that I don't want to get too much into the personal family stuff, but there is, like, I'm not going to spend too much time on the details of the personal family drama, but one of the things that I've also noticed about this, which maybe goes a little bit more with, if you consider the archetype of Jupiter and Gemini, which is sort of this thing going on where we're talking about Virgo has the ruler Mercury, and Mercury is going to be in this retrograde. Venus is going to be in a retrograde. Mercury is a place. Virgo is a place where Mercury rules, and Venus is in fall, and Jupiter is in detriment. And then in Pisces, you've got Jupiter as a ruler, Venus is an exaltation ruler, and Jupiter is in a Mercury sign. So you've kind of got this Jupiter-Mercury. It's like you got a lot of Jupiter-Mercury dynamics going on around these signs, basically, due to their rulership. And with Jupiter and Gemini, which also is going to be aspecting these eclipses, or because Jupiter in Gemini is going to be basically square the nodes, right? So Jupiter in Gemini is at a sensitive point, and Gemini and Virgo are both ruled by Mercury. So there's a sort of like Jupiter-Mercury sensitivity going on, and there's some kind of archetype with the twins, right? And the two fishes, the double-bodied signs, a certain kind of dualism. And one of the things that comes up for me with this is the pattern of sibling rivalries or sibling conflicts. And, you know, in my situation, I live with my mother and my sister, and I'm not going to try to talk about all my issues with my family or anything like that. But there is some kind of sort of pattern that has played out, not just on my mom's side of the family, but also my dad's side of the family. where my dad and my dad passed away back in 2013, but one of the things that was happening was there's this whole problem in the family with elder abuse, where his brother was basically trying to steal all the family's inheritance for himself, and also, or just try to manipulate his elderly grandmother into giving all this money and all this kind of stuff. And it was just like, my dad was really stressed out by this and had a heart attack before it was resolved. But there's this thing going on where my dad was an Aquarius, and his brother that he had this big conflict with was Leo, right? And so they were siblings that, if you look at it from astrology, they were siblings that had this opposition on the Leo Aquarius axis, right? And now both of those people have passed away, and his other brother was a Capricorn, who was not as there was whatever less he was lessly whatever. We're not going to get into all the details with that, with my dad's side of the family. My mom's side of the family, there's some kind of conflict between her and her sister that has been long running, which I don't want to get into all the details and unpack, but I think, there's another thing too where I have been upfront about having a mental health condition that apparently, when you have, this sort of like in the bipolar kind of area, apparently it's a genetic, hereditary kind of condition. And my mother will always say that my aunt had some kind of problem, her sister had some kind of problem, but the family was always hush about it. But basically that, like, my mom is like kind of like the rational, successful, kind of stable one, and her sister is just like crazy, basically. And there's some kind of like, my mom's brother just died, and there's this kind of like, we're not having a funeral for him, we're not going out to visit the family, and there's all this weird, like, instead of, I don't know how normal people deal with this stuff, but like there's this weird conflict between my mom and her sister that, I just spent a lot of time last year doing IFS therapy style, and one of the things about IFS is this idea that we kind of internalize these family dynamics, and we have this sort of like internal family system. And part of that internal family system is the idea of exiles and managers, right? And there's this sort of bad blood in my mom's family, or between her and her sister, because I think a lot of it basically has to do, or like there's also this dynamic with both my dad's family and my mom's family, where in my dad's side of the family, nobody had kids except for him, right? And also, he was a little bit more successful with his business, his career, and stuff like that. And the similar pattern was also with my mom's side of the family, that she was the only member. Her brothers and sisters didn't have children. Her brothers and sisters weren't as, I don't know how you define what success is, but there's something about it where, like, you can understand how, like, if you never really are that successful and you never establish yourself independently from your family, and you're like a grown adult living with your parents, you can understand how that would be a position that you don't feel very confident and secure about, and you feel maybe, without being like, without making this about you being overcome with jealousy and resentment towards your more successful family members, you could still maybe emphasize with somebody who is mentally ill, unsuccessful, labeled as the crazy one, the problem child of the family, and so they're stuck living with their family, and then when you have your successful sibling come over with their husband and their children, and they get to just like show off how they have a happy family and how successful they are, meanwhile the rest of the family is all, mentally ill and unstable and, just dependent on family members. I can emphasize why there might be a bit of like, bad emotion there. So I'm actually, whereas there's some kind of like thing going on where when I deal with my mother, she does like, she's very much wrapped up in her own perspective and is basically like, I don't have a relationship with my, I haven't been able to have a connection with my family for the past decade, basically because when you know, like the paternal grandparent was alive, when you have this authority figure, it's basically like, don't come here, because when you come here, your mentally ill sister gets upset by it because she's so. I mean, maybe I'm filling in the blanks, but like that's how I understand it, right? I don't know if this is too personal. I don't know. Maybe some people out there, maybe this will do something for people. I don't know, right? But there's this kind of thing where, like with IF, there's this kind of pattern where you've got this problem where you've got a conflict between siblings, or a conflict between members of the family, and then you've got an authority figure who takes it upon themselves that is their job to manage this conflict, to keep peace, basically, right? And in order to keep peace, sometimes you just have to say, I don't know how to make this more peaceful, just stay away, because when you come by, it makes it worse. And so there's all this resentment in both directions. In one way, being all like, you think you're so better because you're successful, blah, blah, blah. Or then in the other way, you've robbed me of my connection to my family because you were such a fuck up and they had to protect you or something, right? And they both hate each other. And then in the midst of it, it's like, for some reason, it's just I'm sorry if this is a bummer, but there's a certain like thing where it just sucks, because in the midst of it, like you could have the other family members die and pass away, and there doesn't seem to be any issue about the whole family coming together for the ritual, like, you know, this idea that you believe in, we put our personal differences aside and we remember the loss of our dear, like nobody, it's like the brother who nobody cares about, like the brother, and then it just gets focused on these people just playing out this thing where they just hate each other. And it's like, and then meanwhile, like I live with my sister, and like I'm not saying that I have a really, I don't know, it's not like, it is what it is. I'm always under this pressure with in this family dynamic to basically treat my sister really nicely, to not have any conflicts with my sister, to be like we're just little saints and we just treat each other so nicely, so everything's peaceful and harmonious. Meanwhile, the rest of the family just hates each other and like won't talk to each other, and it's just like, so like it just feels like this weird double standard, right? And it's sort of like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. So that's like the family stuff. I don't know. And again, I don't know if I said too much or not, or if I'm oversharing, but like, what I'm trying to say is that I think there are these, for me as an astrologer, you know, it's like, you can see these family dynamics and you can use, you can use all sorts of typologies or categories or labels to try to understand what's going on. But in both the situation of like my dad and the conflict with his brother, or my mom and the conflict with her sister, you can just look at it from an astrology perspective and see these oppositional tensions playing out, right, between one side and the other, and that and how this plays into this eclipse, how you've got the eclipses are starting between Virgo and Pisces, and they have reignited this family drama between the Virgo sister and the Pisces sister. And, you know, the Virgo sister is the responsible one who, you know, is very organized, puts all her ducks in a row. And then the Pisces sister is the one who's blamed as being the problem child, who is like the crazy one, who's all overly emotional and stuff like this, right? So you can see like the earth, and you can see the water, and you can see the Saturn being that, don't, you know, we're not going to go there. We're not going to, you know, we're just this weird like wall of like the Cold War of like, we're not going to talk to each other and all this kind of stuff, right? The playing out at this family level, and like Saturn as a planet rules the opposition, right? It rules the opposition of that conflict of just like two oppositional sides who are just not giving each other, not, you know, it's like playing chicken. Like it's like where the kind of thing is where you are. And, you know, I think like maybe you could also extend this even to the trade war, because a lot of times in the trade war, it feels like Canada is like the little brother of the United States, and is just being abused by like a bullying older brother, right? This is funny because I don't, and this is the whole thing is like I always feel like there's this kind of unfair, well, whatever. I don't know. You want to be peaceful with your family. You want to get along with your family and stuff like that. You don't want to, but like it's so funny because when I'm growing up, I grew up with a sister, and you don't like. There's a whole thing about like boys don't punch girls, So this kind of like growing up as the only male of the like a male sibling and a female sibling, and just like being conditioned not to solve sibling conflicts with like boys will be boys style violence, and then seeing how that plays out in all male siblings where you've got my next door neighbors. I remember they would just like wail on each other, and they'd be really weird about like possessiveness, where like they'd be real like this whole thing about this is my stuff, this is your stuff, and if I catch you playing my video game console, I'm gonna beat your ass. And then like this kind of thing where it's just like any little like, so these like you have these spoiled brat kids where they each has to have like their own like instead of having each sibling has their own, like, they share a video game console. Like, they're rich kids, and they both get their own copies. Or, like, if one takes the thing of the other, they just start wailing on each other. And it's like, and then you have to be like, go to your rooms, kids. Like, there's like this weird, like, that kind, or like, this kind of thing where the older, or like this imbalance of power where the older brother has all the power, and maybe it's just insignificant, and the older brother just wants a dumb excuse to wail on his little brother to make his little brother feel insignificant, or know what the pecking order is like, right? Like there's these kind of dynamics, and then this kind of like, time out, you two, just go to your rooms, don't talk to each other, and then okay, time out, or the trade war, okay, time out for another month, where we'll just like, who knows if a trade war is happening or not. It's just psychological. It's a Psy-op. It's a psychological war. It's a meme war now, right? I don't think the trade war is ever going to actually happen. I think at this point right now we are in a meme war or a Psy-op, basically, rather than an actual thing that's going to materialize as a real war, right? Or it's like the Cold War applied rather than to a exchange of like, like the Cold War was about nuclear warfare. This is like a Cold War trade war where, maybe at some point in time we might start like having a trade, but we're just, it's all up in the air. Nobody knows what's going to happen, right? And it also this is it's also kind of funny because it reminds me of I've got back into playing Elden Ring again, although I'm making myself take a break right now because I feel like I've developed, when I play Elden Ring, I develop a condition which I call Elden Wrist, where I just like, there's the damn boss fights are just too intense, and I just like and I'm playing the controller and now my wrist is sore. But there's something about Elden Ring, how it's like an action game that's all about, it's like there's a strategy in it that's about pacing and rhythm, and that you're like having two guys, you're like fighting the guy, and you're like watching him to try to study his rhythm and his pacing, and this guy will like, when is this guy going to charge you for an attack, and then you have to retreat, and then you time it out, or when are you going to charge him for an attack, and then this kind of like we're not, there's something funny about it because it's like obviously a trade war is happening at a much different scale than like, two knights with swords fighting each other or something like that, right? But like there's still this kind of like dynamic of like, are you gonna like, how does the other guy respond to the move that you are making, and then how do you respond to the move that guy's making? And there's a kind of a dialectic or a reactivity in that, right? I was thinking about this too, that like you take this principle of reactivity and you think about like a video game, like you play a video game, you enter a virtual world that is created and designed by other people, and there may be a certain number of choices that you can make in terms of how you build your character, or what kind of choices you make in the plot for an RPG or something like that. But you are, even with all the options that they give you, you are still playing a game created by somebody else, in a world created by somebody else, where all your options are necessarily in reaction to that environment, which you at no point do you have any control over. You're just responding to the world that you are put in, right? And there's something about that principle where you are just like, you don't actually have any choice. You're just reacting to the circumstance. That you don't make up the rules. You just adapt to the rules the best way possible, right? And then in that kind of circumstance, all you can do is observe the way that your different opponents act and react, and try to develop the best way to react. So there's this kind of like chain reaction of like two opponents watching each other, studying each other's moves, and trying to anticipate what the other person's move is going to be. And we're in this situation right now with the inability. We're kind of blinded by this ability to predict what the hell is going on, especially because like the whole idea of a trade war, or the idea is that we're going to give you a month to prepare for this thing, and then what happens in a month's time is just another delay. And then so like people are telling you you're gonna prepare for this attack, and then it never comes. And then you just get impatient, and then, okay, well, we'll attack you then, fine. And then just to say, maybe you get the sense maybe you'll back off then, right? But there's this there's something that feels very dialectical about this, the current, but it's like that dialectical thing, but also being blinded in that you have no ability to really predict how this situation is going to play out, because it's not. And there's the kind of what often people call Trump the black swan because of this, right? Because you know how a white swan is going to do, because you've seen so many white swans before, but there's no guarantee that the black swan is going to just be like a white swan with different color feathers. The black swan could do something completely unpredictable, and this is what's throwing everything off into a state of chaos and uncertainty, right? But so like in that situation, when the future is so uncertain, what it does is it ends up having this effect of bringing everything back to the present moment, where it's just like the two opponents are eyeing each other off, just being very, you have to be at this hyper vigilance of having to be hyper attentive and hyper aware of studying every little micro movement, and what is he going to go this direction or that direction, and how do you respond to that? I don't know, maybe I'm getting stuck on this particular idea too much, right? So other than that, so I've talked about the trade war, I've talked about my own family drama and the sibling thing, and also relating that sibling thing to a kind of a dialectic or a sort of reactivity between two enemies, and this sort of like how Virgo is all future oriented, is all planning oriented, and now we're in a state of blindness where I think that's kind of what defines this. It's sort of like, also Saturn and Neptune often stands for like cloudiness, fogginess, in a kind of fog of uncertainty or confusion, where you're not seeing clearly what the situation is. This kind of defines the situation we're in. I think there's also, now that I've got this out of the way, there's another, I'm going to call that the mundane first half hour of the video, talking things from a more mundane level of what's going on, at the level of interpersonal family stuff, at the level of international political stuff. And now it's time to address this in a more philosophical approach. And I'm just going to catch my breath before I do this and collect my thoughts. So hold on. Okay. I don't know. before I get into this, I have to just say something. It's kind of funny because there is this kind of principle about like letting go, and that if there's any maybe good thing that comes from this transit, that maybe there can be a, like, the self node is often associated with letting go of things, right? And there's a certain, it's just, but it's funny to see it play out with the family thing with my mom, and my mom is the Virgo and her sister is the Pisces, because there's certain kind of thing where, like, I don't know, in my, you'll have your idea. This kind of maybe is a good segue into the other point of that's more philosophical, right? That we have, who knows where it comes from, but it seems like when we deal with reality, the reality that we all inhabit, some people like to do this multiverse thing and suggest that there is really, like, every possibility is manifested in some multiple reality, and that we've just, that we've just landed in this one version of reality, and there's all these other versions of reality out there. I don't know if I actually like the multiverse idea, because I don't see any way to substantiate it, to prove or disprove that actually exists. Because from our actual empirical experience, there's only one reality that we experience. What we experience is that we're on a timeline that everybody else in this reality seems to share the same timeline. I don't think, there are certain weird quirks, though, about Mandela effects of Berenstain Bears, whatever it is, right? Berenstain Bears. There's some kind of, like, I'm not going to get into that one, right? But there is this sort of idea of the reality that we're in. The reality, like, to give thy family situation, if we're in a reality where my mother is estranged from her family, her brother is dead, we're not going to have a funeral, nobody seems particularly concerned about that, the importance of, like, that, that, like, you have a family member die, and what is more important is, like, this ongoing feud and all the bad blood between the surviving siblings, rather than the memory of the one who passed away. It's kind of like the whole situation itself seems to imply the existence of a different reality where things are as they should be, in the sense that a different reality where we can have a funeral for your uncle who passed away, where the siblings can put aside their differences and cooperate, where we can understand that if you judge things like being able to have a family or a successful career as a success, that it's necessary that some people are going to be more successful than others, and there's no reason for, I don't know. There's so many, I don't have to pick it apart in so many different ways, but there's so many kind of like the whole, there's a sense that the world that we live in is imperfect, and that there's some other world where all the imperfections of this world have been corrected and set straight, and everything is as it should be. But that's only something that we can imagine, that we can look at what the situation we're faced with, and we can imagine how things might be better, or how we might improve things, but that vision of an improved, better world is always just something that frustrates us, because it's never the situation that we have to deal with. And if you notice that I have a poster of Philip K. Dick beside me, one of the things that Philip K. Dick talked about was, he was famous for this video where he was trying to announce that reality was a simulation. I don't know about if he really, there's a whole kind of question about that whole stuff, like the Matrix simulation theory, all this kind of stuff. But Philip K. Dick was concerned very much with reality and illusion, and what was real and what wasn't real. And there's something about where Philip K. Dick said that one of the markers, there's this whole, there's that kind of expression, like, pinch me, if I'm dreaming, or that it's too good to be true. Like if it's too good to be true, it probably is to be. It's probably reason to be suspicious if something sounds too good to be true. And if you actually do, if you fall for it, you're naive and you're gullible. But if you have experience, you know that things that sound like they're too good to be true often are, because reality is defined by a certain kind of imperfection, right? So that there's a certain thing of like we can trust that the world that we live in is a reliable, real world, that it's authentic, not because it meets our ideal because of what a world should be, but because it doesn't. It's like, because the world isn't what we think it should be, that gives us the ability to trust it as having an inherent objective reality. That we have all these visions of these multiple realities that we would rather be in, rather than the one that we have to deal with and accept, even though we don't like it. But like the fact that we would rather be somewhere else, but we have in some other version of reality, but this is the one we have to deal with, is the stamp of authenticity that makes this the real experience for us. And then this stamp of authenticity it's like this inherent imperfection of all things, and it relates to the whole archetype of Adam and Eve in the fall from the Garden of Eden. Because if you remember how that story goes, when they eat the fruit, it gives them the ability to discern between good and evil, right? And so if you have the ability to discern from good and evil, it's the ability to look at the world around you and realize that you're not in paradise, that you're in a world that's full of imperfections and flaws, and it has this funny way of just playing out in this way that you're like, well, I would have thought that like a good world would be like this, but the one that we're in doesn't match that image that I have, right? And for this reason, there's this kind of idea of like a world of, this is the whole thing, Platonic idealism deals with the idea of a world of perfect forms, where this is expressed by the Platonists in this idea of geometry. This idea that you can have a geometric perfect circle, or these perfect geometric shapes, but in nature rarely follows this kind of geometric precision, and there's all sorts of variations and imperfections and flaws and things that give way to like diseases or disorders or chaos and uncertainty. And this is basically, this whole pattern has created this sense that that there's a dualism or a dichotomy between the natural world, or the real world that we inhabit, as being inherently flawed and imperfect, versus a world of perfect forms that provide a kind of a blueprint or an archetypal pattern, but every manifestation of those forms are imperfect, right? But then the thing is, if you start looking at this more closely, and then you can maybe take you could compare the sibling rivalry that I was talking about, that played out both with my dad and his brother, and my mother and her sister, and how the family dynamics are always fraught with these sibling tensions, which seem to like play out to the extent where it basically, instead of having a large kind of family gathering and family solidarity, everybody's estranged from each other, and nobody wants to talk to each other. Everybody has or whatever. I mean, there's this archetype that they talk about in the Bible with Kane and Abel, where basically, if I remember correctly, it's like they both have to present like a gift, like as a sacrifice to God, and one of them, both present kinds of food, and God likes I think the idea is that Kane is a vegan and Abel is a meat eater or something like that, and that Abel sacrifices animals to God and Kane just sacrifices vegetables, and God is more impressed with the animal sacrifice, and then so he favoritizes one brother over the other, and then the other brother, Kane, is pissed off like that, so he takes revenge. And so this kind of thing of like, this is sort of like thing where like this petty sibling rivalry of like daddy likes the other brother more than me, so I hate him and I'm gonna kill him. And then like that isn't like that's not an archetype of what's perfect. That's an archetype of what's flawed, right? Like it's not. You would think that in a perfect archetypal form would be like the archetypal father loves both of his sons unconditionally or loves everybody equally and is impartial. But the Old Testament God is a God who plays favorites and who will, if you blatantly just pick one person that he likes over the other, and then fueling these sibling rivalries where they kill each other. And then there's the whole thing about the Avenged Sevenfold, or what they named this the stupid metal band named themselves after this. They're not a very good band in my opinion, but you know, like the whole thing that then Kane is somehow protected by, like, for some reason rather than being punished, then he's given this protection that, like, you know, we will take pity on this guy because he was not able to control his jealousy issues or something. At least that's my ability. That's the best I can do to talk about the Kane and Abel story. Correct me if I got it wrong. So there's this kind of idea that you take that kind of thing of the Old Testament God being kind of an asshole in a lot of, and there's also the Book of Job, all this kind of stuff. There's also this kind of idea that oftentimes the Greek myths were like tragedies. That there's like especially like Apollo and stuff like that. Like Apollo would like find a friend and then want to play a frisbee game with him, and then like kills the friend by like throwing the wrong thing at his friend and like taking his head off or something. Right? There's all these kind of like tragic accidents in the myths where the myths do not seem like they are. The myths aren't even the mythic archetypes in mythology are often tragic and like it just shows these patterns of like people getting caught in the same cycles of suffering over and over again, and that's not even really perfect in some way, right? But there's some kind of this becomes described as the suffering that happens between the natural world and the world of perfect Platonic forms, where there's always some tension because the natural world can never be a perfect circle or a perfect square or a perfect. And then this is kind of funny because even astrology the system of astrology is kind of like inherent with this, because the sky, there's no inherent. I mean, there's this whole idea that there is an inherent order in the sky because people would watch the stars and they would see that the planets moved in very predictable ways. That you could see that the orbits of the planets had predictable speeds, predictable motions, predictable cycles of retrogrades, and that if you studied this, you could see there was underlying laws underneath a whole world of uncertainty and kind of chaos. And then there's an attempt to discern the unchanging laws from the ever-changing world of natural forms or whatever, right? And this is the Platonic ideal being some kind of perfect geometrical law that exists as a kind of underpinning of all this, right? Now, in all of this, I'm kind of bringing this up because there's this other kind of issue that I don't know if anybody cares about this, but I am a person who I like reading Deleuze, and I in fact decided to wear my Explain Deleuze to Me t-shirt for this video because of this. That one of the things about this is that there's a certain sort of tension between Deleuze and astrology in some way, anyways. In that I don't like. One of the things is I hesitate to brand myself, to label myself as a Deleuzian, let alone a Deleuzian astrologer. Because when there's this kind of idea of like, if somebody is saying that you're a Deleuzian, like in what sense do they mean that you're a Deleuzian? Like, in relation to what specifically, right? And that one of the things about reading Deleuze were that there seems to be this trend where Deleuze is known for a rejection of transcendentalism and then that as he, in the late stage of his work, he ended up going in his direct. He wrote this essay about pure immanence, and so there's this issue between the immanent and the transcendent. And Deleuze makes this argument that there is no transcendent, there is no like Platonic world of perfect forms. There is no transcendent like a substratum, some sort of layer of reality that underpins everything. That everything that exists here and now, immanently, and the idea that there is a transcendent is an illusion, or that the idea that this is like, there's this kind of like perspective that the weird studies guys were always going in with this, and it's kind of like the idea that we're faced with this issue where the real world that we have to deal with is always seeming to be imperfect or fallen or somehow not this ideal good, and this idea that we're always creating this image in our heads of a more ideal world that isn't here, and we're always feeling the pain of not being in that world. There's this idea that it's not that the ideal is some alternate universe that we have been cast out of because we don't vibrate high enough or something like that. Or, you know what I mean? It's like the ideal is an inspiration for what we might do to work to make the world a better place. To see that, that you could see these, like, I don't know, family dynamics playing out and being like, I can't change the past and everything that's happened, but I can look at this and say, at least I can use this to motivate me to try to do better in terms of my responsibility with my action of how I'm living my own life. But then I'm limited to all the things that I can do as a person. But it's an inspiration for how I might act or what kind of changes I might make in my own life. To try to make the world that we live in closer to an ideal, are we living in a kind of paradise or are we living in a hell world? And like, what can you do to make the world closer to being a paradise? And maybe, but the whole thing is like this ideal, the transcendent ideal is that we're never going to quite make it there. The thing about this is that there's this idea that Virgo is often associated with the Virgin, and there's this idea there's a sort of like problem about that stuff, this idea that the virginal purity being like you've saved yourself from the temptations of material pleasure, of sensual pleasure in the material world. This is what this Carl Jungians often talk about I don't really like the word divine masculine, divine feminine, but there's often this kind of idea that the divine masculine and the divine feminine is out of whack, and oftentimes this is like comes from this idea of a certain style of transcendence that is averse to, that puts itself at odds with the pleasures and the sensuality of being grounded in material existence. But if you look at the Virgo archetype, there's this idea of like having a critical awareness or having a rational awareness that could even just be like, if you take Mercury as a scientist or like a planner or even an accountant, it's like the ability to do math. If you think about math, like the idea that math is kind of like the scientists actually kind of believe that mathematics may be a kind of like this Platonic ideal where there's this world of just pure numbers, and that in our material world, our analog world, we have all this material stuff, but we can take account of it, and we can add it up. We can make calculations that will enable us to plan for the future and all this kind of stuff. And so there's Virgo kind of has this ability to like be like mind over matter, right? To be like, rather than just being like enjoying the taste of food and all this kind of stuff, we can step back and we can like you can weigh everything, measure it, calculate it, see how much this was going to last us, make all these precise calculations, plan out exactly how much we're going to need, all this kind of stuff. This is like the Virgo attitude. And, like my mother actually worked in agriculture, this whole idea of this, and this is kind of interesting with the whole trade war, because there's this kind of issue where Donald Trump really doesn't like the way that Canada, like we have our own dairy industry, and what we do is we try to make sure that we produce enough milk, that we have enough dairy for our population, so that there's enough supply in the grocery store without being too much, so that all the stuff is going bad on the shelf. That like you have all this you don't want to make more product and then just have it be a waste of money because the supply and the demand is off, right? So we try to have it very balanced so our production matches our demand evenly without it being too expensive or something like that. And the Americans just want to flood the market with a lot of cheap product, which is like raised on, antibiotics, hormones, and all this kind of stuff. And meanwhile, they're trying to do like make America healthy again. But you want to they have all this factory farming where they just make shit as cheap as possible, and they try to make too much of it, and then they want to flood our market with it and disrupt our ability to balance. So now I've gone back to the mundane of the practical of measuring and calculating and seeing how much we're getting. Like there's this there's this mercurial, scientific, or this sort of practical. Virgo loves practicality of like this mind over matter practicality. But we're in this sort of era where now it's just like there's the leaden weight of Saturn has just obstructed all this, and we feel like we just have to be present. We just, instead of planning for what's in the future, we have to be present in the present moment. And if they say there's going to be a trade war tomorrow, don't believe them. We just have to be present with what is here today, and that's the only thing that we know is real. And then it becomes this game of just like constantly just watching the other party and seeing where they move, and this constant state of hyper reactivity where you're like everything, you've got your like sword fight. You're just like, waiting for them to make the wrong step so you can just, come in and get them, right? And so, this is you don't know what move they're going to make. So you just have to like be complete like laser focus, and then just wait for them to slip up so you can fuck them over, basically, right? Because this is obviously not, this is what it's become, is rather than being cooperation, it's now PvP combat, basically, right? And it's also like PvP combat in the idea of like an older brother and a younger brother who are not even like, this isn't like Russia. Also, the whole thing about Russia and Ukraine. It's also funny because Ukraine I've been to the Ukraine. It's a very poor country. It was like when I was in the Ukraine, like here in Canada, I have these dogs that we look after from an animal rescue, right? In the Ukraine, there are so many dogs like this that are just wild in the street. They have no animal control. They're like, I was there way before they had the current war. I was there in 2009, and they're just like, you just have like mobs and mobs of stray dogs everywhere, in the street, like loose. It's like a completely different reality over there, right? And there's this idea of like a place where that their economy has been not very good for. It's like this idea that in capitalism, the big fish eat the little ones, right? This is the whole premise, whether you're Putin or Trump or Microsoft, or whether you're this idea is that the way capitalism works is that some people get rich and get lots of money, and then they can do hostile takeovers, or they can become these big multinational conglomerates, and that the things that are easiest to take over are the most vulnerable things, right? But like so you have this dynamic where you have the rich people waging war on the poorest people, and the most vulnerable, and the most weak, and the most being exploited by the most powerful, and this like obvious obvious sense of inequality there, where you have the most powerful people in the world just looking to squeeze the most vulnerable people for all they're worth. And then, but the thing is, like, Canada isn't, like, Canada, we're actually fairly wealthy. So it's kind of like, you want to just try to make us poor with a trade war. We're not the Ukraine. You're not going to, like, I don't know. I'm not that up on my economics, so I'm not going to go there. But I've kind of gone back in the direction of the trade war stuff. And I forgot about what I'm trying to say about, like, Deleuze, though. Or, like, Deleuze and Platonism. Right? This thing about, like, I may be wearing the Deleuze t-shirt, but I'm not, one of the reasons why I'm not, I actually have a certain sympathy for Transcendentalism. And the sympathy from Transcendentalism comes from the fact that if you like, I mean, I'm not really Transcendentalism I'm not really that fussed about making mathematics the Platonic world of perfect forms, but rather this idea that without Transcendentalism, if you have pure immanence, where there is nothing outside of this immanent world that we inhabit, which is imperfect, and that our vision of an ideal world is just inspiration for us to make the world better, we are under a lot of pressure to take responsibility for this world that we're in. Whereas if there is a transcendental, and that this world is imperfect because it can never be that perfect thing that we are always striving for, then that at least it's not to say that don't try to make the world a better place, but if we only get halfway there, we can at least feel a kind of relief in that, like that if we tried to make a utopia, it would be too good to be true, right? That's the way that dystopia happens, is that, or the false utopia. Utopia actually means, the U in utopia means non-existent. It's like as a place that doesn't exist, like the imaginary paradise that doesn't exist. If you accept that the imaginary paradise doesn't exist, never existed, will never exist, then if you fail in making your world, our reality, a utopia, a paradise, it's not a bug, it's a feature, because the imperfection of our reality is the stamp of authenticity. Because the point is that the world that we live in is not just a wish fulfillment machine. It's not just like a gratification machine. It's not just a thing that gives you everything you want. The fact that the world resists, like that we have an idea of what we expect the world to be, what we want the world to be, what we think the world ought to be, but if you suspend those judgments and let the world be exactly what it is, you'll see that the world has its own spirit, its own autonomy, its own suchness, its own essence, right? This is what they call the soul of the world. The world has its own spirit, where if you say, I think the world should be like this, the world says, well, sorry, that's not what I am. I'm the world. I'm not this thing. I'm not your little, like, I'm not this thing that's there to be your little, like, paradise utopia. I'm the world. And you know that I'm the world because I'm not the paradise you wanted to be. I'm me. I'm an imperfect thing with a lot of flaws, with a lot of dangers, with a lot of uncertainty. I'm not just some paradise thing that's there to make you happy. Right? But then if you consider, like, the whole, I mean, what does it take to be happy? To have food in your stomach, to have a roof over your heads, to know that you're not going to get bombed or something. There are, maybe there's a lot of people that don't have those privileges, that don't have that sense of security, that don't have that sense of stability. But there's no reason why we can't work to help more people have that basic sense of stability and security. But, it's like, for some reason, even if we think that that's the way things should go, the world is stubborn. The world's like, well, you want to have more stability and security? well, what if we get chaos? What if we get disruption? What if we get destruction? I don't know. I mean, you want that, but you don't always get what you can't always get what you want, like the Rolling Stones say, right? So there's some kind of thing that, like, by transcendentalism, I don't know. The communists don't like transcendentalism because they see transcendentalism as another excuse not to make the world a better place for people, right? The idea, there's a sort of like communist thing, materialist thing, where they don't want to have a transcendent realm because they don't want the world to be just something that you accept with all its flaws and imperfections, and you let go of trying to make the world some paradise utopia or something like that. They want to be like, to take away all those excuses. We don't have any excuse. We have this terrible responsibility that the only reason the world is the way it is because of our actions that we need to take responsibility for. But then it just becomes, there's a certain, like, you don't have any, if you are completely, entirely responsible for your actions and their outcome, and that if you fuck up, make a mistake, do the wrong thing, you don't have any God to forgive you of your sins. You don't have any possibility for atonement. You don't have any possibility for salvation. You are just, it's like, you have your bed that you make, that you sleep in it, and that is it. And there's nothing other than that. And that is dead fucking serious. We gotta do something. We can't just fucking sit here and just accept things. We gotta fucking take responsibility if that's the case. It's some serious shit, right? But we live this reality where people don't like instead of using the idea that there's no transcendent, it's all immanent, as this, we have to take responsibility for our lives because there is no heaven afterwards. We have to make this as good as it can be. Instead of using that to take responsibility, what it tends to be is like, we use that as instead of wanting to take responsibility, we say, I prefer to live in a pure immanent world where there is no transcendent, because then I can feel like I can live my life without having some eye in the sky God constantly judging me for everything that I do. Right? That in an immanent, if the world is just immanent, there is nothing, no higher structure, higher order of higher perfect forms, it's all just this, then I'm off the hook. When I die, I don't have to worry about the last judgment when I die. I don't have to worry about some sort of code of conduct that you are, if you don't meet this to the T, you're going to be a sinner and you're going to be tortured for eternal damnation. I can just be an imperfect, flawed human being and live my life without that judgment. But then the actual world that we live in is then created from all these people who are just like, oh, nobody can judge me. I can just do what I want. There is no good and evil. I can just do whatever, and I don't have to make the world a better place. We can just let it be what it is, right? And then, but this kind of thing. Would you get, like, if you go, we both go in opposite directions. Do we come around and meet in the same place, or do we just go farther away? Right? I don't know. Like, there's this kind of dualism in that sense. So, okay, this is an hour video now. So, I think this is good enough. I think I've expressed what I'm trying to say. I like Deleuze, but I'm not a Deleuzian astrologer, and I don't recommend anyone try to make Deleuzian astrology into a thing. And I have some sympathy for the idea of the transcendent, and I don't think I believe in pure immanence. Or, I don't know, it's also this kind of idea of, like, regardless of what you believe or you don't believe, there's some kind of, like, I think it's somehow necessary that we keep this idea that a perfect world that's all just about meeting your idea of what you think it should be is a function of the imagination, but the real world is always going to be what it is. It's always going to be have this dynamic to it that it's not going to be what you want, and that this creates a sort of divine longing for some perfect thing that's never going to be, and that the only way that we, unfortunately, the only way that we have of realizing that is to take responsibility for our own actions and try to actualize it. And unfortunately, that's, if you just follow this through, that's what religion was trying to do in the first place, by trying to get people not to, to lie, cheat, steal, murder, commit all these sins. They were trying to get people to somehow live in a way where they take responsibility for their actions and do not create a stupid, imperfect situation, right? That to try to make the world as much of a paradise as possible. That's what they were trying to do in the first place. But we don't like that because we don't like the idea of being judged. Right, so like we don't want to feel like anybody's judging us, so that we can also be so we don't have to we're off the hook. We just let everything go. We don't have to do anything. But then it's like, how do you live your life like that? You're like, okay, great. I'm just gonna turn this video off, and I don't have to take responsibility for anything because the world's imperfect. I can just be a fuck up. Great, okay, Like, you can't live like that. You're under this, there's some kind of force which keeps, you can't just be like, oh, it's just some sky daddy judging me, and he doesn't exist, so I get to be a big dirtbag, and there's nothing, I have no responsibility to anybody for anything, because there is no God, there is no morality, and that the world, this is how I interpret the meaning of this transit, this eclipse cycle. The immanence and the transcendence, the materialism and the spiritualism, the duality, the non-duality, the sibling rivalry, the dialectic, the reactivity. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends. Keep on rocking the free world.